specialists within the state. Joining us today are Amber Raditz, Kelsey Highland, and Sherry Schwartz. We're located in different parts of the state, and we'd be happy to connect with you in the future. The Agricultural Water Quality Program was created at UW-Madison to help address the complex relationship between ag practices and water quality. Today, we're going to learn about how the presence of tile drainage in the landscape impact nutrient movement and water quality. We'll also learn how old and broken tile lines can accelerate nutrient losses and find effective ways of identifying problem lines using maps and field inspections. Today is our first webinar of the 2025 webinar season. Feel free to scan the QR code on this flyer to register for all webinars if you haven't. Before we get started, here are a few Zoom housekeeping things. First, we would love to have you submit questions to us related to today's topic. Please type them in the Q&A box, again, in the Q&A box in your Zoom that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Anything that you can put a question mark behind should go there. Also, please use the upvote Q&A feature shown as a thumbs up icon to vote for questions that you would like to be answered during the webinar. Please put any comments or issues related to logistics into the chat box, and we will address those separately. Second, if you would like to receive a CCA credit on soil and water, we will display a QR code at the end of the session. You can then scan the QR code from your phone to register for credits, or put your CCA number in the chat and we can register them for you. Our two speakers today will share about 40 minutes of presentation time. After that, we will facilitate a brief Q&A. Okay, enough of the logistics, and let's get started. In the next hour, we will together learn about tile drainage and its impacts on water quality. Our first speaker, Laura Paletta, is an outreach specialist in the Agricultural Water Quality Program, joining us from Green Bay, and Laura focuses her programming on issues in the eastern side of our state. Without further ado, take it away, Laura.
Great, thanks, Golong. Let's share my screen, get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Laura Paletta, an outreach specialist with Ag Water Quality Program. And as Golong mentioned, I'll be sharing the impacts of water quality within tile drainage systems. So a little taste of what I'll be sharing today. So things we'll learn, we're gonna look at tile discharge, and we'll see that there is minimal soil and phosphorus loss. However, there is increased nitrate losses within tiled systems. And then I'll share some in-field practices to help reduce this N loss before it enters the tile, and share some edge of field engineering practices that can further reduce this nitrogen after it enters the tile. So tiled systems have been used for quite a while. Pictures here are taken from the United States. Tiling started to occur within the mid-1800s in the form of clay tiles. So clay tiles were put in to try to especially in wet areas, to try to increase agricultural and cropped land. Today, you'll see when fields are being tiled, it looks more like this image on the bottom. We use plastic corrugated tile that has perforations to allow water movement. This simple graphic I included to try to show how tile drainage works. So tiles are put in about 3 feet under the soil surface, and tile allows excess gravitational water in the soil profile at the surface to move down and move off of the land, out of the landscape. So again, really trying to remove that extra gravitational water, and it might help dry out the soils a little faster. Typically in the past, tiles have been put in place in the field where it's extremely wet or stays wetter longer, or in areas of concentrated flow. But this type of grid pattern is becoming more and more common. So the entire field has a grid pattern tile like this image here. This map is from the 2022 Ag Census, showing per county how much of the county has tile drainage. You'll see Iowa, southern Minnesota, throughout the Midwest here, areas that are heavily tiled. And our state, Wisconsin, doesn't have as much tile drainage. There is a bit more in the northeast side of the state there. That's probably due to the higher clay soils. So the Northeast has those more clay in their soil. So again, helping to perhaps dry out the soil in the springtime. And so even though the state doesn't have as much tile drainage, it still does exist here. And I know it's becoming more of a hot topic, or a topic of interest in the state. So it does cause and raise some questions in what tile drainage, what the impacts are on water quality, how it influences the movement of nutrients, and overall this question here, how does tile impact nutrient movement, water movement? Does it cause more infiltration and movement into the soil profile? And again, really looking at nutrients. Where are they moving into the profile? Are they moving too deep out of the root zone? Do plants have time to take them up? So all these questions arose, which led to Discovery Farms leading an investigation. They looked into it using their edge of field research sites. So this picture here is Discovery Farms edge of field monitoring station. And they compared what they found from just surface runoff versus tile. So looking at the amount of flow, so throughout the entire year, they collected surface runoff only 8 times throughout the year. So 8 times they were able to collect something that run off the surface, water that moved off of the surface, and that's on average 8 days. Compared to fields that had tile, they were able to collect water moving through the tile 174 times throughout the year. So water just moves differently when tile is in place. What that means for nutrients, here we're looking at soil loss, again comparing surface, so what soil loss is left, what soil is lost from surface runoff versus through tile drainage. And this is annually, so we see 135 pounds per acre on average annually lost from the surface runoff, versus tile, we're at 11 pounds per acre. So we're not too concerned when tile is in place. We're not concerned about our soil loss. That is a small caveat, I guess. I did want to mention tile blowouts. So if there is a tile blowout in a field with tile, that can increase your sediment loss. So I quickly wanted to go through what a tile blowout is. So tile blowouts can be caused from a weak point in your tile drainage, often from tile age. So I've been in fields with blowouts from old clay tile that have been in place for a long time. Improper venting or some undersized tile could cause this weak point. To then this pressure buildup causes the drain to rupture, causing a big area. The soil is drawn down, a big void left in the soil, ultimately a sinkhole forming. So a direct pathway, a direct conduit for nutrients, water, manure to go directly into the sinkhole, directly into the tile. So in this case, sediment would be increased. What does a blowout look like from the surface? Here's a couple examples of tile blowouts. Sometimes you might hear kind of a hissing noise, or again, like that a vacuum noise, that pressure being released, or if you have water bubbling, if it's very wet, that could be a sign for a blowout. This image here is a tile blowout repair on the eastern side of the state, and you can see just how much sediment was built up into that tile where there was a blowout. So imagine all that sediment now being moved out through the tile and ending up in a ditch or in a stream further down the line. So often, we don't see a lot of sediment loss. So if your tile is working as it should correctly, we don't see a lot of sediment loss, but in some of these special cases, if you do have a blowout, that could mean sediment loss is increased. Switching gears here to phosphorus. So here again, Discovery Farms, what they found in total phosphorus, surface versus tile, 0.9 pounds per acre annually was lost for total phosphorus on the surface versus 0.08 pounds per acre in your tiled systems. So again, here, don't need to be too worried about total phosphorus loss increases in a tiled system. However, we do see a different trend in total nitrogen. So we do see higher total nitrogen losses within tiled systems versus surface. So we have 20.5 pounds of total N versus 3.8 seen in surface. So this was something we Discovery Farms wanted to dig into a little bit and focus in on nitrogen losses. I do want to talk about preferential flow paths as well. So when thinking about nitrogen, and I should mention that was largely in the nitrate form, preferential flow paths also have a big impact when tile is in the system. So preferential flow paths can also increase nutrient movement. This picture was an example in the field. Somebody placed blue dye right on the soil surface and then watched how that blue dye moved into the profile. So you can see it moved down quite a bit, it's moved laterally, and then where those three arrows are pointing at, those would be the preferential flow path. So you can see that blue dye moved into the flow path. Often the reason for these the preferential flow path creation is from long-term no-till, high clay soils, or earthworm activity. So in soils that are not disrupted, earthworms are creating their flow paths. And an interesting note on earthworm activity, it's been found that in no-tillage fields, earthworms are doubled, and in fields with tile, earthworm populations are doubled. And when there's tile, often that soil dries out a bit quicker, so that makes the environment more inhabitable from earthworms. So again, all this to say, when you have tile in the system, there's just some new considerations to take into account, especially when talking about spreading manure. So this image here, again, showing the preferential flow paths. You might also have heard them being referred to as macropores. So again, just areas in the soil that could lead directly to your tile drainage line. So when spreading manure, it's just, again, something to think about if you have tile and you're spreading manure. It's important to check if tile lines are flowing. If the morning you want to spread, you check your tile lines and water is flowing out of them, that might mean your soil is too wet, and adding manure, adding more liquid into that soil could cause oversaturation. Oppositely, if soils are too dry, you might have large cracks in your soil, again, leading to a direct conduit straight to the tile line. If you spread your manure, it could go directly to the tile and not have that nice soil buffer. And you would have a higher risk if manure is less than 5% solid. So more solids in your manure would allow slower movement of that manure down into the profile. So again, all this just to share some new considerations to take into account when spreading manure if you have a tiled system in place. Back to the nitrate loss, that nitrogen loss that we saw with Discovery Farms. I wanted to see if there were other studies that showed similar findings. And so I found this very similar setup edge of field study in Northern New York. So they had a similar setup to Discovery Farms, collecting edge of field runoff in tiled systems as well. And they also were a dairy farm with manure. And they had a very similar pattern. They found very similar results. Surface along the top there versus tile on the bottom. For soil loss and for total phosphorus, they did not find that tile plays a role. It's actually soil loss and total phosphorus are reduced. However, in total nitrogen and in nitrate, tile does again increase in a tiled system. So focusing in on that total N and nitrate. So how can we limit this nitrogen loss? How do we limit the nitrate from being lost into the tiled system? I wanted to kind of split it up into two different ways, or two different types of recommendations. We want to think about before it gets into the tile, what can we do in fields so we keep it on our field rather than it moving into our tile? And then once it gets into our tile, what can we do about it? So improving our nitrogen management is a great way to try to limit that nitrogen movement before it gets into our tile. So things like reducing our rate. Is there ways we can just reduce the amount of N we're adding, really following our nutrient management plan, also looking at splitting applications or just timing of our application. Are we spreading nitrogen when our crops need it, when their roots can pull up that nitrogen? Thinking about the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship, all those great in-field strategies. Cover crops are also a great way to reduce nitrate in tile lines. This first study was in Iowa that was, again, comparing on a tiled field, utilizing cover crops versus no cover crops. The cover crops practice is the circles on the bottom. We see the cover crops significantly did reduce nitrate concentrations in the tile losses. And Shalimar Armstrong, who just presented at the WASH conference in December, shared his study, again, looking at tiled fields using cover crops versus no cover crops. On a 5-year average, he did find that cover crops can reduce nitrate losses up to 31%. So significantly reducing our nitrate losses with cover crops. Thinking cover crops out on our fields in the winter and spring when typically they're bare. We just have a growing root, growing cover crop to pull up any nitrogen or nitrates can really help then being lost in tile lines. Now say that nitrogen, though, that nitrate does move into the tile line, there's a whole array of engineered strategies that can help reduce that nitrogen and that nitrate. So I listed six kind of engineered strategies here. I tried to kind of rank them from maybe an easier, lower hanging fruit control drainage down to more infrastructure, maybe more cost, recycled drainage water type system here. This picture here is of a bioreactor. And I did want to point out this bioreactor because Discovery Farms and with the help of NRCS just implemented one. They built one in Kewaunee County. So we're hoping this year, 2025, to have some of the first results looking at this exact issue. So as tile water moves off of a field with higher nitrates, how does a bioreactor lower the nitrate levels? So hopefully stay tuned for some great data there. And I just want to briefly share pictures again of these these engineered strategies. All of them kind of work similarly. They try to use denitrification to reduce the nitrate. So denitrification changes the form of nitrogen from nitrate to a nitrate into a nitrogen gas. So it's released that way rather than staying in the water. So again, you can just see here, I just wanted to show, again, examples of how much infrastructure might be needed to how complicated they might be. So depending on your goals or how much space you might have at your edge of field to implement one of these practices. I do want to point out too and give a shout out to Dr. Malika Noko, who is hosting a tile drainage workshop in February in Fond du Lac. The registration link will be shared in the chat, and her agenda and all the different speakers will go into great detail, much more detail on these practices. So if you're interested, please check that out. Okay, to wrap up, and I want to give some takeaway messages from the studies I shared today. So we see that tile drainage, they do have limited impact on sediment and total phosphorus losses, but it is important to fix those tile blowouts to limit any additional sediment losses. But we did see that tile discharge does have increased nitrate losses. So it's that nitrate we really want to focus on minimizing the movement in our tile systems. Infield practices can really help reduce that N from entering the tile. So again, just improving nitrogen management, maybe throwing in a cover crop within our system can really help keep nitrogen and nitrate on our field rather than moving into the tile. But I know there's only kind of so much we can do when it comes to infield practices. So adding an edge of field engineered practice, teaming up kind of using both before and after practices, sorry, like before infield practices versus after it reaches the tile practices, can really help overall reduce the end movement. So again, we want to keep nitrogen. We're paying for fertilizer or paying for spread our manure. We want to make sure it stays on our field. It's utilized by crops rather than being lost, losing money and impacting our water quality. So with that, I'd like to thank you and share my email with any further discussion or questions, and definitely have some time for questions at the end after Kevin's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was really a great presentation. And as we're transitioning to our next speaker, Kevin, we are launching a quick poll to collect your demographics. This information helps us evaluate the audience we're reaching, and that further helps us with our future work. We appreciate you to fill out the polls as always. Also, as a heads up, there will be a question as you leave the webinar today at the end of the hour that asks you about today's webinar topic. That self-rating also helps us to improve our future programming. So please take a moment to grab some water and answer that while you leave the webinar. Okay. We'll take a few more seconds as people are answering their polls. It is cool on my side that I can see how many people have. There we go. Beautiful. Thank you all for filling out the poll surveys. And now we'll transition into our second talk.
Okay. So folks want to
Yes.
confirm that they can see my screen here. If somebody give me a thumbs up.
Yes, Kevin. Let me introduce you to our folks real quick. Kevin Earp. Kevin is the program manager for the Conservation Professional Training Program at UW-Madison Extension, and he has extensive knowledge and experience in tile drainage and manure management. Now, Kevin, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Like Laura, I'm based here in Green Bay, but also a statewide extension specialist. And what we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about is how do we find old drain tile systems? Why do we want to do that? And hopefully touch on some of the questions that have been popping up here in the chat as well. So start out, why do we want to map old tile? Well, it makes repairing and upgrades much easier. For those of you that are permit farm or CAFO size, we occasionally find manure in tile, and so knowing where they are can help us respond to a problem much more quickly as well. Get a number of questions. Well, why do I care about the tile that was put in 30, 40, 70 years ago? The reality is tile can wind back and forth across property lines. And if you're not aware of what's there, you expand your system, you fix a blowout, you can actually create more problems, not only for yourself, but for your neighbors. The other thing is that a lot of our original grid tile systems may have been put in on 50, 60, even 80-foot spacings. And so if that existing tile is working, if you're able to split the laterals, you can save some money and make everything work better. Another reason, particularly here in Wisconsin, we've got a lot of what I call midnight connections, where neighbors sometimes tied their own tile systems in the middle of the night or when the crops were growing into their neighbors. Also seen a lot of septic systems, tool shed drains, barn drains, particularly milk house waste going into Drain tile systems had a situation in Outagamie County, probably about more than 10 years or so ago now, where we had a drain tile that was plugged, and one farm had a leaking manure pit, another had their milk house waste drain going in, and a neighbor had their septic system all feeding in to that same tile, and it was causing some issues. The photo you see here on the right is a farm in Kewaunee County. When that farm was built on a field that had previously just been corn soybean, nobody knew about the clay tile that were there. When the manure storage was dug, the contractor saw it and decided just to smash it with a backhoe. And a few years later, we lost about 250,000 gallons of manure over a 12-hour period into that wetland that you see in the upper part of the photo there. And so knowing where we've got tile obviously helps if we're going to do construction. My family, in addition to farming, also built houses, and there were several times where we'd be building a house and run into drain tile that nobody knew was there, which was pouring water into the foundation of the crawl space, and so it had to be dealt with. So a quick history, Laura talked a little bit about this, but if we think back, repurposing Civil War cannonballs, they were attached to a sled. You started with a couple of guys on this sled and a large crank, started at the stream, and the oxen slowly pulled it up into the field. 2 or 4 guys on there, slowly turning that crank to get some slope. Interestingly enough, some of those bullet or passage systems were still functioning in central Wisconsin as recently as 15 years ago. So some of the old things that were there still working. We do see occasionally in Wisconsin, particularly the northern part, some wooden or three-sided tile that were put in originally. Then we went to clay in the 1940s, began to get into concrete, and more recently into plastic. The issue we have with that clay and concrete tile is it does break down over time. That life expectancy does vary. The other thing that I've heard a little bit about is that tile that was built during the pandemic, because it was hard to get the plastic. Sometimes that sat out. Farmers would buy it and let it sit outside for a year or two until they needed it because they were afraid they couldn't get it exposed to ultraviolet light that weakens it. And so we may be seeing some issues in the future with some of that tile that was put in during the pandemic. So that clay and concrete tile was not easy to install, and so a lot of times only what was necessary, wet spot to wet spot, draining a side hill seep was put in. This was actually taken on my home farm in Illinois in 1904 when the drainage district put in tile. All of that was brought in by rail, unloaded by hand dug in with a slip scraper and horses, or hand dug. Very labor intensive. So we've got the stuff that's been out there for a while. How do we find it? Well, I'm going to go over a few things here. And if you noticed on my opening slide, I had given credit to Steve Hoffman, an in-depth agronomy firm out of Manitowoc County that's done phenomenal work helping farmers find ways to find tile. And so some of the techniques I'm going to be talking about here really came from Steve Hoffman and that agronomy group. But I always like to start with the old and even the newer air photos. Yield maps and some of those field observations are critical. I have a few folks playing with the transponders. A lot of times the septic guys that are cleaning out pipes, they've got a camera. That camera has a transponder on it. And so they're going a couple 100 feet up some of the sewer lines and actually can do the same thing with drain tile to find that. There's what I call the Budweiser Euchre method that I'll get into here close to the end, and a few folks playing with drones and ground penetrating radar as well. So one of the things I like is those 1930s air photos. They're available for almost every state. I know we've got a few folks outside of Wisconsin with us today. Most states, but not all, they're GIS compatible. They're ortho photos, so you can bring them into your system. You can layer them very nicely. And so the key thing is a lot of those things on old air photos that look like tile are actually not. So this is out of Iowa, and you see those white patterns on there in those fields that are within the circle. Originally, I glanced at it, yeah, this is tile. But then I start thinking, well, how is this connected? Does it make sense? And start looking at it. No, that's actually corn shocks from when corn was harvested by hand. or some of the small grain shocks, I believe. The lines you see on there are hand drawn on from the 1930s, or I believe, or 40s when drain tile was put in. And so just a couple of photos here from that same spot in Iowa. And if you notice the photo on the right with the circle, you can see the differences in soil color because the old methods of tile installation brought up that subsoil, so it's more plainly visible. And compare that to the hand-drawn lines on the right. Some of them are close, but not really. Then we start looking at some of the more recent air photos, and on the left here, you can see that darker green in a wet year. Corn is growing much better, much healthier above the drain tile. And that matches up very nicely with what the air photo shows on the right. So what I like to do is to start with multiple years, multiple layers of air photos. You don't need GIS software, but it is helpful if you've got it. But just looking at them on the screen and going through them, having them printed out on the kitchen table, you can pick up a lot of things. And so you take that same square mile, that same area, and you start looking for patterns over years. One of the really neat tools that I like is Google Earth. It's a free program, Google Earth Pro. I use the downloaded version on my desktop, but Google Earth has a time machine function, which you can access in the upper corner here in the circle with the little clock with a backward arrow, or by clicking on the year down here in the bottom, and basically zoom in on a field, and you can flip through multiple years worth of air photos, and they're updating every once in a while, both backwards and forward. So some things are going to show up some years, but not in others. So this is out of central Calumet County, a few miles north of Chilton, and just a phenomenally good picture taken the exact right 3-day period in spring. And what you can see here is these drain tiles showing up very clearly because the soil is drying out a little bit quicker. In the upper left-hand corner of the photo here, you can see two parallel lines. Looking back at old air photos, I believe that was lines installed each side of a waterway. And over time, that waterway has no longer been needed or has been taken out, but those tiles are still there. In the upper right area here, you can see the line coming in from the road ditch and 4 parallel lines, probably draining a wet spot. And like I said, good conditions like this may only show up about once every 3 years. And sometimes on the air photos, you get extremely lucky. In this case, one out of Iowa, they captured right after the drain tile was actually being installed. When I gave this presentation for a watershed group in New York a few weeks ago, some of the photos I picked up off of Google Earth actually showed the tile being installed on that particular day. So here's 3 photos from Calumet County, all out of Google Earth, showing 3 different years. And so on the upper left here, really taken kind of the wrong time of the year. I'm really not seeing anything. If I look at the upper right on the field that's tilled, not the alfalfa field here, I can see those drain tiles fairly clearly in that tilled soil where it's a little bit wetter, it's dried out. And the bottom photo here, exact same site. And the tile are showing up here, but this is a wet year. And so I'm seeing the better crop growth. So multiple years are very good. The one caveat I have about Google Earth is you'll see down here in the bottom, there is a date. I believe the year. I don't always believe the calendar date because I've seen very good photos showing green everywhere that supposedly were taken in November. So just be aware that sometimes those are not perfect. So why do they show up some years, not others? Well, soil moisture differences, that dry soil warms up more quickly. And you can see that here, and that's why we can sometimes use infrared photography to pick up drain tile too. So this is infrared photography actually taken out of central Illinois. Champaign County, the Soil and Water District, Land and Water Conservation District did airplane flights in the 70s and 80s with infrared to try to figure out where drain tile are. Once again, the soil dries out a little bit quicker, so it's a little bit warmer. And so what you can see here is a little bit of drain tile on the left-hand photo showing up in red. Obviously, not everything does. You can see a lot of other areas that have drain tile in there, as illustrated by the map on the right, but it's one piece of the puzzle to try to help you figure out where they are. So where can I get these photos? Well, county property tax authorities, your county treasurer's office has air photos. Some of our Wisconsin counties actually now have infrared as well. There's online maps, Bing, Google Earth, Web Soil Survey that you can look at. And the state cartographer's office has some as well. So Farm Service Agency has yearly photos. Some of the more recent ones do include infrared. UW-Madison's Real Earth server does have both regular and infrared going back to the mid 2000s, I believe 2006 or so. They need to update. I don't think they've updated in a few years, but there is 6 or 7 years worth of imagery there. And your NRCS or Land and Water Conservation Office, if the drainage system was put in prior to 1985, may actually have those design or as installed maps in the files that go with your fields. So like I said, you're going to look at those county GIS websites playing around yesterday. This one is from Wood County, and I was just playing around in that Marshfield area, kind of looking around. Once again, in the center here, I've got something that kind of looks like drain tile, but when I was flipping through multiple years and kind of looking at this pattern, it doesn't match what I would expect. This is more the crop residue left behind a combine and affecting the growth of the crop or the coloration or soil temperature. So once again, a caveat, not everything that looks like drain tile actually is. Here's one out of Iowa that one year showed right after it was installed. Once again, shows up very clearly. And this one is out of Outagamie County. And on the left, you can see from Outagamie, these are the different years. Once you zoom in on a field, you can just click on the different years icons on the left, and it'll put up the air photos for the field that you're actually on. And so very nicely in here, I can see that grid tile pattern in this particular field. I can see sort of a wet spot to wet spot in this east and west running field just across the road from this pond here. So a lot of neat things that you can do, start looking at those air photos. Then you add in the low-level drone. So this is a wet year. I believe this is Fond du Lac County, or it could be part of Manitowoc, I'm not sure. But running across this particular field, I can see those darker green areas in a wet year where the corn is healthier. I can also see this area here down by the woods. It's darker green, sort of a finger in, probably a little bit sandier soil that's a little bit better drained. Field observations as well. The one on the left here, you can see that corn is taller by about 6 to 8 inches and darker green above the tile in a wet year. This is one of Steve Hoffman in-depth agronomy photos. The one on the right is an alfalfa field that I took. Once again, actually, I think this was a little bit drier year. And because the tile is draining a couple of wet spots, there's more moisture and the crop is a little bit healthier. Field observations, another alfalfa field on the left. On the right, you can see that soil is dried as it's headed toward the house. In a case like this, I would be slightly suspicious that maybe that drain tile is plugged into the septic system for that house. So sometimes I can feel things out that way. Years ago, we used to pressurize drain tile, throw in the smoke bombs fire departments use for training, and smoke tile to help us figure out not only where they are, but to show those interconnections between the surface and the tile systems. I was always very cautious to make sure that when we were pressurizing tile systems, that there was not a house septic system plugged into those. So obviously field observations, if you're out in the field, you see a tile blowout, you should map that. All of our phones have GPS capability. Even if you don't have a specific app, you can just go into Google Maps, zoom in on your location, do a screenshot, be a very good one. There's also a app called What 3 Words that very quickly can narrow you down to within 10 feet of where you are anywhere on the planet. There was a question in the chat about surface inlets and nutrient and sediment contributions. I would look at that the same as I would a tile blowout. Anytime I've got surface water directly entering, whether it's through a engineered Higginbotham inlet or whether it's a tile blowout, I'm going to be carrying an awful lot of sediment, sediment-attached nutrients like phosphorus, and in my runoff water, nitrates and maybe other contaminants into that drain tile system as well. Yield maps are another neat tool that Steve Hoffman began exploring, and I've picked a few photos of his here. I really like the wet year data when I'm doing this, but realize not every difference you see on a yield map is due to drainage. Soil fertility, soil type, compaction all play a role. But here's a couple of examples. So if I look at those green areas, high yielding, they match up very well with the identified drain tile in the field. But that upper arrow points to that corner of the field where it sure looks like I probably have more tile that's not mapped, that's functioning well and improving yield. The two lower arrows are pointing to where we have known drain tile going through areas with very low yields. So chances are we're looking at a situation where those tiles are not functioning the way they should. They've collapsed, they're filled with soil, something, or they're not sized properly. Something needs to be addressed there to improve yield and drainage. Topographic maps, LiDAR maps can help too. This is a topographic map, and you can see the blue intermittent streams on here. All of these were replaced by the drainage district, and so they're no longer intermittent streams. They're soils, fields that are farmed all the way through until you get to the bottom where the railroad intersects that. So some of our older streams are gone, but chances are there's good-sized mains in those low areas as well. So as we kind of look at wrapping up here, let's look at building that map. I like to follow Steve's lead here and color code by source. So I can go back, look at things again. I like to do the entire section. I also like to look at the fields adjacent to where I'm at. So I'm mapping into those fields as well, even if they're not my fields. Hey, someday I may rent or manage those fields, but also trying to figure out where a blockage may be. Mapping the neighbor's field with the air photos can be beneficial as well. Make sure you're adding to that map those tile outfalls, particularly our CAFOs that have to manage the tile outfalls and monitor those during and after application. Mark those every time you find one. There's the tile inlets and vents that you need to be marking as well, and any other features that you may see. I mentioned earlier what I call the Budweiser Euchre method. Go down to the co-op or wherever the retired farmers are drinking beer, drinking coffee, playing cards, see what they remember. Take in several air photos. You get a good conversation going. I found this to be very helpful. And sometimes you get lucky. The map on the right here was a farmer that I worked with years ago. And every time there was an installation, he hand drew onto his map where the tiles were, the size, the direction the water was flowing. There's a number of retired tile guys around. Give them a 6-pack, sit down with the maps, have them look at them. They'll be able to pick out things as well. Other technologies, very briefly, ground penetrating radar, transponders. Ground penetrating radar has been used in other states. Its applicability here in Wisconsin is limited. It picks up rocks as well. And in our high calcium soil, particularly along the eastern side of the state and up around Lake Superior, the areas on the eastern side where Laura showed earlier, we have a lot of tile, are our high calcium soils, and so it's not as effective there as well. Remote sensing, that thread rod with a transponder for shorter distances, a few hundred feet can work. If you've got a camera with it, that helps too. So to kind of summarize, why are we spending the time and money? It makes those repairs easier. It makes adding to and tying into those older systems easier. And having been out with farmers, incredibly frustrated after spending a lot of money trying to find tile, digging a 300-foot or longer backhoe trench and not finding it, having that map makes things a whole lot easier. So with that, I will wrap things up. See if anybody has any other ideas they want to share in the chat. And Laura, I think you and I can kind of look at some of the questions. Several of them are posed here to you. And so we can go from there.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a great presentation. And now we'll transition into Q&A. Um, Kevin, if you don't mind, stop sharing for a minute, and then we'll pull up the CCA code after Q&A. So I think let's start with let's start with potassium. There's a question in the Q&A talking about K loss. Any insights there?
Yeah, I can answer that one. So, the question about potassium, I guess I talked about, I shared soil loss, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So I assume they're curious about potassium too. Um, I guess when it comes to potassium, it's to date, potassium hasn't been kind of designated as a major water quality concern. So when Discovery Farms does their water quality analysis, potassium isn't really, I guess, considered or looked at. So I guess I don't have a good result or anything to kind of share back on potassium.
Yeah, we're concerned about nitrogen in surface water because it fertilizes the algae, gives us the hypoxic zone in salt water like the Gulf of Mexico, but also a human and animal health concern. Phosphorus in freshwater streams and lakes in Wisconsin feeds the algae, which also creates a water quality problem, potential of fish kills. So potassium, I've heard it said the only way you're going to kill potassium in a lake is if you dump a load of fertilizer on the ice and whatever melts through and crushes fish as it falls to the bottom. That's really the fish health concern you're going to have with potassium. Probably not a scientific answer, but it makes the point.
Thank you.
So I'm seeing a
Um,
question go on here about installation regulations.
mhm.
So there is not a licensing requirement for tile drain installers in Wisconsin. We have a lot of farms that have bought their own tile pump. Extension every few years does offer a tile drainage school, which goes into the specifics that really gets in depth. The program that was mentioned earlier, that's February 20th in Fond du Lac, will cover the basics, but we'll also cover some of the regulations as well, because they can be complex. In some cases, you're dealing with eligibility for USDA, NRCS farm programs, Farm Service Agency. In other case, DNR and Army Corps regulations. And we could spend an hour talking about that here, but I would suggest people attend that program. We're also thinking about a virtual version in March of that as well. But we also have an attorney that's familiar with water law, because there's a lot of questions out there. Well, if I discharge at the property line, is that going to get me in trouble with the neighbor? What's legally allowed? We're going to be talking about that in that February 20th session as well.
Sounds great. Thank you, Kevin. I see that there is some questions about nitrogen. Bill asked, can you address the impacts of urease and nitrification inhibitors and losses through volatilization slash leaching slash denitrification compared to the cover crops reduction? Let's start with that question.
I can take a swing at it, and then Kevin, please feel free to jump in. So yes, I think maybe the question is stemming from, right, I mentioned infield practices to help reduce nitrate loss. And so you can also try to use an inhibitor, and that, yes, that would help also reduce nitrate movement, hopefully. I guess I don't have specifics off the top of my head how that might compare to what I shared, but that definitely could play a role. Um, yeah, so I don't off the top of my head how that would compare to cover crop loss reductions, but that is another piece to the puzzle that could be a good infield practice to try.
And your inhibitors are generally designed to prevent the conversion of some forms of nitrogen to more leachable forms. And so what's already in a leachable form in the soil is very susceptible to be lost under the right conditions, or actually wrong conditions per se. So while it can be helpful. I think we're probably better off outside of manure to really looking at putting that nitrogen fertilizer on closer to the time that the corn actually needs it, instead of putting it on in October, the fall before.
Hmm. Thank you both. And when it comes to nitrogen inhibitors, it's really important to think about like it's trying to how long is that going to be in effect, right? Some of these are very short-term turnaround, and these may be the effectiveness can vary quite dramatically depending on weather as well. And I see that Bill also asked any word on nitrous oxide emissions. Do we have any insights on that?
I was gonna say, I guess I don't have any specific numbers either. Yep. Kevin, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I don't have any either. I think that's something that there's a regional group of extension drainage experts. So maybe that's a question we pose to them.
Mhm. Thank you. Lisa asked, I think I heard the nitrate loss was potentially reduced by cover crops by 30%. Is that true within Wisconsin's climate, especially under no-till systems?
Yeah, or no tiling, she asked. So I guess
Oh,
yes.
no
So
tiling. Yeah.
what I shared, so that graph by Armstrong, that yes, over a 5-year period, 31% reduction, I think it was exactly, with cover crops in a tile system. That study was done in Illinois, so not too far from Wisconsin's climate. We do get pretty cold here pretty early, so I guess maybe the thought is if we plant cover crops too late, we don't have a lot growing. I guess it definitely does depend on planting date. You want to try to get your cover crops planted as early as you can to try to get some good root growth. And then, hopefully they plant an overwintering cover crop. And then, of course, how well it does or doesn't do with nitrates or holding on to nutrients, it depends on the species. I know Discovery Farms has looked into various species and gets species of cover crops or mixes, and you can have some mixed results. So yeah, a lot of it is when you can get it planted, and then which species you use. So there might be some different results depending on those things.
Thank you.
We've got a final question here,
Mhm.
suggestions where I can find county history on the installation and maintenance. So for counties that have drainage districts, those drainage districts may have records. And I see that Bart Chapman is with us today as part of the program, but there is, I think there's about 70 or 80 drainage districts in Wisconsin that are active or recently active. And so just Googling Wisconsin drainage districts, StatCap, you should come up with their website that can give you local contact information for what the drainage districts may have. Otherwise, there was a push in the 80s and 90s to have drain tile contractors, when they retired, turn over their records to county GIS departments or land and water conservation departments. They weren't GIS, they were the treasurer's office. Unfortunately, a lot of those weren't saved because people didn't understand the value of them. But a number of county land and water conservation departments have begun mapping the records they have and making those available upon request. So I would start off with your county land and water conservation department, and also Googling Wisconsin drainage districts DATCAP, and you should find there the local contacts for your drainage district.
Sounds great. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Laura. Great presentations today. I think that's all the time we have for questions. If the team at Agwater want to stop recording, and Kevin, if you don't mind sharing the CCA code slide,